So the floor now is to Dr. Wentholt, University of Humanistic Studies. You have also 20 minutes, yes, and also a PowerPoint, I understand. So I'm also sitting over there now, otherwise I can't follow. Thank you. The floor is to you.
Thank you so much. I will try to learn from Stefan van der Poel, who actually was my professor back in university when I was a student, and use his space of speech. But if I speak too quickly, please correct me. So my presentation today is called The Fall of Yugoslavia and the Rise of Nationalism, Facing the Past in the Western Balkans. And I think in that sense, it's very much a prelude to the presentation by Klaske, I realized. This rise of nationalism is exactly the thing that these cultural initiatives are resisting against. So this is actually what is at stake. So I am going to raise the problem today, and hopefully we've already been presented the solution by Klaske, so we can all sit back and are happy that people are actually already doing the work on the ground to resist this nationalism. Now, this politics of the past in relation to EU accession was the topic of my PhD thesis, and today I will focus specifically on nationalism. The fall of Yugoslavia. So just a short disclaimer, I have no roots in the area, I have no family ties to the area. I did learn the languages, much easier than Hungarian, I can say. But actually the fall to Yugoslavia is to me what shockingly 9/11 is to my current students, right? It's something that happened around the day I was born, but I did not experience myself. So when I think of Yugoslavia, I have the same cliches in my mind that many of us, I think, have from TV. You know, the flag, then of course Tito, who already died in 1980, but is still very much personalized as Yugoslavia. And then from a socialist federation, it fell apart into different nation states. And this process of disintegration, of course, went hand in hand with these wars. Now, this is the general picture that we think of when we think of the Yugoslav wars, ethnic wars. So we often see images like these, where we see that before the war, to the left, a country was Bosnia was very diverse. People of different ethnicities were living alongside each other. And on the right, we see that after the war, the region was, so to say, ethnically cleansed. Right? So people with same ethnicities lived in the same areas. What we can also see on the right is that the Dayton Peace Agreement of 1995 actually made the wartime reality into a constitutional peacetime reality. So the ethnic division, the ethnic cleansing that had taken place was translated into the new constitution of Bosnia. Right? So people from different ethnicities were believed not to be able to cooperate together. Were believed to have to be divided. Now, in this presentation, I would like to offer a little bit of let's say, a challenge to this idea of ethnic wars and civil war. And that is because there was also a lot of resistance to nationalism, even during, before, and also now after the war. And for me, always a nice example of this is the Concert for Peace that was held in Sarajevo in 1991, where hundreds of thousands of people were saying, we do not want war. We are a multicultural city. We are a multicultural federation, Yugoslavia. We do not want war. Some may have wanted independence, but no war. So that is why I would like to speak not of a civil war, but of a war of nationalist mobilization and aggression. Because I believe it was not people who ended up fighting against each other, but it was political leaders that mobilized nationalism to achieve their nationalist goals. And I think this frame of nationalism, of political nationalism, is very relevant because it can also help us understand what is happening now in the Balkans and why that is so relevant. Ironically, sadly, it took another war for people in Western Europe to realize the danger of right-wing nationalism in the Western Balkans, namely the war in Ukraine. Because of the war in Ukraine, we have seen that especially in Serbia, there are many people who are in support of Russia, and they are mainly from these right-wing nationalist groups. I'm going to try to show you a short fragment from a documentary. This is, as you can imagine, always a scary thing to do at a conference, but I've always seen that the audience works. So if you give me 5 seconds, I will start it up.
And in case of any potential clashes or violence in Bosnia, I'm of opinion that it will first start in Brčko, and I'm pretty sure that organizations such as these would be used as some sort of force in the beginning in order to create violence or spread terror among the local non-Serb population in Brčko.
The potential threat posed by Sveti Georgie and other Russian-backed groups has to be seen in a new light following Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
We've seen not only an assault on a sovereign country, but we have seen also an assault on the rules-based order. We are going into uncharted territory. So there are risks.
Cilj je isti. Kao što Rusija ne želi Ukrajinu u NATO i Evropskoj uniji.
I've never seen such smooth technical facilities at a conference. So can we have a quick applause for the organization? Thank you. Now, this is all me that I actually don't know how to go back to the PowerPoint. So I think this illustrates the direct links and the direct dangers of mobilizing this nationalism in Ukraine, but also in the Western Balkans. But actually, this is not new. Already when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Crimea, in 2014, Serb nationalists went to Ukraine to fight on the Russian side. Croat nationalists went to Ukraine to fight on the Ukraine side in the infamous now infamous Azov battalion. So we have seen this for a long time. These nationalists that went to Ukraine are often directly the same people that fought in the 90s wars, right? Or they're using the same symbols, or they are their sons, or whatever. So in a time where we were only focusing on jihadism in the Western Balkans, which was actually a huge fear in Western Europe, I think the real fear was right-wing extremism, right-wing nationalism. Now this is being recognized, as I was saying. The EU is thinking of not giving visa anymore to Serb nationalists wanting to come to Western Europe. And I think this is a great idea, as Serb nationalism actually has a very big international reach, especially online. Serb nationalism on platforms like 4chan are read by people in the United States, in Canada, in the Netherlands. Memes of the war in Bosnia are very much used to enforce ideas of white supremacy. You may remember the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand. The shooter actually used Serb war songs, wrote Serb heroes on his weapons when he attacked praying people in a mosque. And here on the newspaper, we see that Serbian media made a direct connection between what happened in Srebrenica and what happened in Bucha in Ukraine to say these are all the same lies from the West, so-called cleanings, genocides that actually did not happen, which of course they believe and is very much incorrect. Okay, so what makes this nationalism so potent? What makes it so strong, and why should we know more about it? Well, one of the main characteristics of this nationalism is that we need to go back in time, and go back in time a long time. We should actually go back to 28 June 1389, the battle at Kosovo-Polje, but I think we'll hear enough about the Ottoman heritage, so I'll stick to the Second World War. So what we're seeing is that these nationalist groups directly use stories and symbols from the imagined past, the Second World War past. And this could happen because during the times of Yugoslavia, there was no real conversation, discussion possible about this Second World War past. Because during the Second World War, 3 big groups had fought against each other. We had, I'm following the clock now, the Ustaše, the Croat fascist nationalist troops. We had the Chetniks, the Serb nationalist group, and we had the partisans, the socialist groups. And the partisans eventually won, but these three groups also fought each other as well as external enemies. To keep unity in the newly created Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia, people did not want to talk too much about the division between these three groups. However, when Tito died and Yugoslavia slowly began to disintegrate, this could lead to a situation where a lot of myths were created about these three groups. So the one I'm going to focus on now is the one on the top right, the Chetniks, the Serb nationalists. So in the running up to the wars, during the wars, and also now after the wars, and that's what I'll be speaking on today, we see that this group of Serb nationalists, the Chetniks, has been mythologized, has been heroicized, has been made into a story that it really isn't. People used, during the wars, the fear of the other to mobilize people to take up arms, to fight in the wars, to start hating their neighbors, basically to instill fear. And this violence of the 90s wars was presented as a direct continuation of the Second World War, right? So, for example, when the Croats began to call for independence, that was framed by Serb nationalists as Croat Ustaše who wanted to again destroy the Serbian nation. When Chetnik nationalists, Serb nationalists began their war rhetoric, it was presented by Croats as, look, we have to protect ourselves against the Serb. Now, we could think, okay, we see how in the 90s wars these narratives got reactivated again, but why does this nationalism, why did this nationalism survive the wars? Why is it still so potent? Well, we're actually seeing that after the wars, this nationalism has only grown, especially in recent years. We mentioned already, democratic backsliding, stabilitocracy, I think is also a good term, which I will come back to later. So we actually see that nationalism is growing, especially in parliament. And I think this has all to do with the use and abuse of the anti-fascist identity. As you may understand, in socialist times, being anti-fascist was a claim that the socialists could make, right? We beat the Nazis, we beat the fascists. But since the wars, this is an identity that has been claimed as well by nationalists. And we call this a process of historical revisionism. And luckily, the term was already introduced in your presentation in this book of historians standing up against historical revisionism. So this is something we are seeing in school books, in museums, but also in law. There are now memory laws that try to portray Serb nationalists as anti-fascist fighters. Now, I'm going to make a little bit of a controversial statement here, but there was already some criticism of the EU presented before, so very much going to benefit from that. I think this shift of creating nationalism as an anti-fascist identity was partly facilitated by the European Union. Because due to lobbyism from Eastern Europe, communism is now presented in the European narrative as being on par with fascism. So in the House of European History, for example, in Brussels, you walk through a hallway where there's fascism on the one side, communism on the other side. This is not to say the EU did this, but this was a narrative that was used by Serb nationalists to say, okay, well, we fought communism. That must make us very good, right? If communism and fascism is the same, then we are anti-fascists, while we know that these nationalists were actually cooperating with fascists. Now, this would all not be so bad if this would indeed be limited to these fringe groups, these small groups on the side. But they aren't, because these extremist small groups are actually very much institutionalized. They have support in parliament. Some of them, like the one you see on the left, Zavednici, now actually is in parliament. And you see them here wearing this ribbon that Russians also use to refer to this imagined anti-fascist past. We see with these memory laws that people like Dragoljub Mihailovic, a general, are actually being rehabilitated now. He was executed by the partisans, also because he collaborated with the fascists, but he is now being rehabilitated and celebrated as a hero. So not only by small groups, not only by hooligans, there's also graffiti of him in football stadiums, but also by mainstream politicians. Mind you, politicians that the EU cooperates with. Okay, now, so this story about nationalism, what is actually at stake here? What are the risks, as long as they're not being mitigated by these wonderful cultural initiatives? Well, I think a lot is at stake here. As I already mentioned, especially Serb nationalism has a huge international reach. So I can guarantee you that there's cooperation between right-wing extremist groups in the Netherlands and right-wing extremist groups in Serbia. And it's those groups in the Netherlands learning from those groups in Serbia. But the risks, of course, are mainly for the region itself. Here we see how Bosnia looks today, divided in a federation made up of Croats and Bosniaks and made up of a Republika Srpska. So as I said, the wartime reality of ethnic division is translated into a peacetime reality, right? If you are not of a certain ethnicity, you cannot be elected into parliament, for example. This means that the risk of a war is increasing when these nationalist groups grow. And this is a very direct relation, and I actually know of Bosniaks who are very, very afraid of another war. And this, of course, this fear of war only, only bolsters these nationalist narratives of having to defend yourself. There's also another risk, and that is the risk of memory, of memory being harmed, of memory like the Jasenovac camp in Croatia being completely scratched off the earth. It's a camp where Jews, but also Serbs were killed, and we see an active effort to erase the memory of that camp. Also very directly, this is a picture of the bridge in Kosovo, in Mitrovica, which is still being protected by troops. And we have been seeing that tensions are arising, and it's very possible that more violence may ensue. I want to end with something positive, and I think there is a lot to be positive about, and that is indeed to be found in the grassroots, right? In people who resist. I think resistance is very important when we talk about these topics, and it's never come from the mainstream, right? Resistance has always come from bottom up. So here we see a group to the top left, which is called the Women in Black, Šenucrnom, who already during the wars protested in Belgrade, in Serbia, against Serb aggression. Already, also after the war, this is on July 10, in Belgrade, I think it was 2012 when I was there, where they held up all the names of the boys and men that were killed by the Bosnian Serb army in Srebrenica. They're standing there every year. You can see there's a lot of police protection, and it's very necessary. But also there are other groups who are fighting for truth and justice, like the Mothers of Srebrenica that we see here to the right. We know them from their fight against the Dutch state, for the Dutch involvement in the genocide in Srebrenica through Dutch Bed 3, but they're also fighting in Bosnia for truth about what happened in Srebrenica and to never repeat that again. So some shimmers of hope. And I think it's these groups that we should support, and we should be very careful with our cooperation with these leaders that actually strengthen nationalism rather than fighting it. So thank you very much. Also thanks to the organization for a wonderful day, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wentholt. The questions and answers will be brought together after 3 related introductory speeches. You were the first.